In the year 26 BCE, just 1 year after Augustus ended the Republic and became the first Roman emperor in history, the young emperor, still full of ambitions for the future of his now empire, commissioned to the governor of Egypt the important mission of conquering the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula. Unfortunately, due to a lack of organization, good decisions made at the right time, and the trust wrongly placed in an Arab guide by the governor of Egypt, this campaign failed totally, being a big humiliation for the young empire that, fortunately for Augustus' legacy, history didn't retain in the grand scheme of things. The full context of how this happened was already explained a few years ago by the content creator named Invicta, making an excellent documentary of this mostly unknown campaign for the casual public and lovers of Roman history. In any case, conquering the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula could have been extremely beneficial in order to massively increase the trade benefits with India and China, finding an alternative to the Silk Road, mostly controlled by the mortal enemies of the Romans, the Parthians, potentially increasing the wealth and knowledge of the world of the Romans by a lot in the long run if this campaign was successful. And today, that's exactly what we are going to see by asking ourselves the next question. What if the Roman Empire conquered the Arabian Peninsula? Or at least part of it. That's what we are going to see in this video. First of all, and once again, I highly recommend you to watch the video of the content creator Invicta, which explains very well how those events happened in real life, and even better, explains all the mistakes that were made by the governor of Egypt at that time, alias Gallus, and what he could have done differently in order to succeed in conquering the west coast of the Arabian Peninsula. So, because Invicta already bothered himself to make a very good explanation of how the Romans could have succeeded in conquering the Arabs, I'll simply let you watch his video and listen to his explanation and take them as the baseline for my alternate scenario. So, in this alternate timeline, the Romans succeeds in conquering the west coast of Arabia, and with that they would get a better access to trade with India and the rest of Asia, avoiding completely the Silk Road mostly under Parthian control, allowing to grow their benefits massively, and giving to the Romans and allies more incentives to travel in order to get more goods and wealth. And these new benefits and wealth would have been very welcomed, because now the Romans would have the extremely difficult task of urbanizing and modernizing the west coast of Arabia, with only two small kingdoms in the south being relatively advanced for their time. Therefore, the process of urbanization and Romanization would start right after the conquest of this new province, founding new cities and building new canals and aqueducts in the places where it was possible to do it so, which means not a lot because this place was quite inhospitable, still is today, but even worse during those times. Now, we might be tempted to consider the possibility of a revolt between the different Arabian tribes across this new province against the Romans, but I highly doubt it. First of all, the local population across those lands was extremely small at best, not more than 500,000, so absolutely not an issue for the Roman legions if they needed to pacify them. Second of all, and the most important, the general mentality of the Arabs that we know from our knowledge of the future in retrospective. Remember, these are the Arabs before Islam unified them and made them conquered in less than a century most of the classical world. Before those times, the Arabs were not unified at all. They were distinct and separated tribes and groups that had almost nothing to do with each other. And that would have stayed the case until Muhammad, or whoever did it, unified the entire peninsula extremely fast and was able to create an extreme devotion and martial vigor in all its population in barely a few years. And that tells us an important thing about the Arabs. Do you know about the different types of personalities that we associate with people in a group? Like the leader, the intellectual guy, the artistic guy, the follower guy, etc. Well, that's also something that happens on the scale of nations or cultures. For example, when I say Swiss people or French people, you have instantly a clear idea of how the average mentality or personality of these people is, right? So what is the most characteristic and recognizable aspect of the Arab mentality? Following. Arabs are followers by nature. They don't think, they don't create, they don't reflect, they follow, and they act in consequence of it. They are probably the biggest follower culture in all of human history, and that's exactly the reason why it was so easy for them to unite as one single culture and empire with only the tool and help of a religion that all of them shared. While, for example, in Europe, Although we eventually became a culture having only one religion compared to more classical times, we ironically became more divided and separated between each other than when we were pagans practicing different religions and cults. And that's simply because we are not a follower culture, we are a revolutionary culture. We change and evolve constantly, we adapt and we modify the things about ourselves that does not benefit us like they used to be, even when it is a mistake to do it so. That's our nature. With all of those examples, what I'm trying to say is that Arabs before Islam, and therefore Arabs without anything to follow, they are a people without an established culture yet, and because of that, the Romanization of that province will be actually extremely easy. Plus, again, their population was very low, so that also helps. Like Cody from Alternate History Hub pointed out in his video of What If the Romans Conquered Germany, it really didn't take that long for other conquered people to identify themselves as Romans, barely a generation or two at best, and I believe that would be even more the case for the Arabs. Being maybe one of the most loyal provinces in all the empire, once the province sees and experiences the benefits that the Romans will give them with their way of life. With all of that, the Roman Empire during the reign of Augustus would have experienced a gigantic economic boost thanks to trade with Asia, and using the commercial experience of the Arabs, who were already at that time pretty familiar with long journeys by caravans or ships for trade. And also, I think thanks to that the understanding of the world for all the Romans will be greater than in our timeline, probably making in the long run the map of Ptolemy even more accurate in this timeline, with the Arabs basically becoming the explorers of the Roman Empire. Also, with now the full control of the western coastline of Arabia and new recruits to find in that new province, I think the plan and benefits to conquer the kingdom of Kush on the other side of the Red Sea would be now totally possible. Because yes, Augustus also tried to conquer the kingdom of Kush, or the Nubians in our real story actually, just 2 years after his failed attempt to conquer the west coast of Arabia in 24 BCE. Now, I'm not saying that he would actually be able to do it in 24 BCE in this timeline. There was still a lot to do in the new province of Western Arabia, but after a few decades of modernizing and urbanizing this area and their people being recruited in the Roman legions, I think the conquest of the Nubians would be absolutely possible and easy to realize with this new land from where planning a new conquest. That would probably happen during the final years of the reign of Augustus, who actually, with all those new lands and wealth acquired in this timeline, he would probably not try even to conquer Germania, realizing during his old age that he made a terrible mistake by overextending so much his empire, being already too big in order to be administrated correctly. So, instead of trying to conquer Germania, he would try to pacify the most aggressive and dangerous tribes, and forming alliances with the most civilized and collaborative tribes as client states, but not have a direct intervention in their affairs and tribal wars between each other. Even though, as well known in retrospective, that would not be enough in order to stop the future menace that the Germans represented for the Romans. But, at the same time, not trying to conquer Germania meant also that it would not cause in them the trauma of the brutal defeat by the Germans, which would push them to adopt more and more a defensive position, and therefore a position that gave signs of weakness to the enemies of Rome, keeping the morale of the army and the Roman people afloat for the moment. Eventually, Augustus would die at the same time as in our timeline, and the following decades of the 1st century CE would happen exactly as in our timeline, with the same emperors and same events. However, a quite notable change is that I think the Romans would not try to conquer Britain, given the enormous difficulty of that task, and how unprofitable it would be, but also because the provinces of the west coast of Arabia and the province of Nubia would become extremely rich due to the abundant trade with India and Asia, exporting goods from the Far East and Asia at an almost industrial speed by the standards of that time, which would make the Roman economy grow and prosper even more than in the original story at that same time, with those two provinces even rivaling in terms of importance to the empire with the province of Egypt. That would also cause one reason less to go to war with the Parthians, and one more reason for the latter to be frustrated by the advantage the Romans had, because without having the need to pass through their territories to trade with Asia, the Parthians could no longer take advantage of imposing very brutal taxes on travelers and explorers who traded between the West and Asia, and in the process impoverishing the Parthian economy, since the Indian kingdoms and the Chinese empire of the Han dynasty, also would find no interest in interacting and trading goods with people less rich and enterprising than the Western Romans, who sometimes reached even their lands in person, causing a much earlier closeness between the West and Asia. Long before that, our timeline, although of course in a limited way, given the technological limits at the time to travel fast across the world. Eventually, we would reach the time of the 5 good emperors, bringing the Pax Romana to its absolute peak. But in this reality, Trajan, after having pacified and stabilized the borders of the empire to the north with the Germans, and having conquered the Dacians as in our timeline, he would not attempt to invade and conquer the Parthians knowing that they were economically weakened compared to our timeline, and that it would be wiser and more profitable to keep them in a more or less peaceful position with the Romans at the same time that they were in a position of weakness. In addition, Trajan, as ambitious as he was not crazy either, and he knew that the empire was very big, too big already, and under the recommendations of his advisors in the Senate, he would understand that the wisest thing was to leave the idea of conquering Parthia for another time. However, he, after having stabilized the situation in the province of Armenia instead of conquering the Parthians, he would use the last years of his reign to consolidate and slightly extend the borders of the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula, expanding its borders on the southern coast of the peninsula to the edges of the eastern coast, and with that, in the absence of having conquered the Parthians, at least they would have a more direct and monitored eye on them in the Persian Gulf. Trajan would build monuments to his greatness, but he would also order the construction of cities, buildings, temples, aqueducts, baths, and other Roman amenities to begin the process of Romanization of the areas that would be largely aided by the already very Romanized Arabs of the West Coast, who would be the ones to concretize and consolidate those new conquered lands as part of the Roman Empire. And after his death, we can assume that Hadrian would still be his successor, and apart from an incident in the province of Judea that required his personal mobilization, it is likely that he would have spent much of his reign traveling throughout the provinces of the empire, consolidating his power and reputation as a great emperor worthy of Trajan himself, although of course due to the Romans in this timeline not having conquered Britain, he would never have built the construct for which he is best known, the Hadrian's Wall that separated southern Britain from the barbarians of the north who were never conquered. So the years would continue to pass, and eventually Hadrian would die, but not before adopting Antoninus Pius under the condition that he in turn would adopt Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius, the latter being originally the person Hadrian considered worthy of being the next emperor. And later, the reign of Marcus Aurelius would begin, having the same difficulties and adversities to face to defend his gigantic empire. However, due to the increased trade and exchange in this timeline with India and Asia, the Antonine Plague of the original story would not occur, or at least not to the same degree of scope as it had in our timeline, since the Romans by then would have been receiving small but constant plagues of the same origin from Asia for more than a century due to the trade routes open on the coasts of the Arabian Peninsula. But that same fact would mean that after several generations, the Romans would have obtained a certain collective immunity to these plagues, making the Antonine Plague, if it occurs, it would not affect the Romans and their population, or at least not too much, if not at all. And that would bring another very positive effect, since Lucius Verus, who was the adoptive brother of Marcus Aurelius, and who would ascend to the rank of co-emperor with Marcus Aurelius, would not die of that plague, although it's not entirely certain that he died because of that plague. But in this alternate history, we are going to assume that it is the reason for his death, making Marcus Aurelius' campaigns against the Germanic tribes, such as the Alemanni and Marcomanni, easier to face with the support from his adoptive brother, with whom fortunately they seem to have a decently good relationship. And it is important to remark that, because Lucius Verus was almost 10 years younger than Marcus Aurelius, therefore it is possible that Lucius Verus would have lived a little longer than Aurelius, enough to prevent Commodus or any other incompetent emperor from coming to power, and thus honor the memory of his adopted brother Marcus Aurelius. However, that attempt to save the position of emperor from corrupt, incompetent, or crazy people, or all three things in the case of Commodus, could lead to something worse than the rise of the dark sheep of Marcus Aurelius' family, that worst thing being a civil war bringing a huge crisis in the empire sooner than in our timeline during the 3rd century. The Romans, hurt and mourning the death of Marcus Aurelius, undoubtedly the most unanimously beloved of the emperors the empire ever had, were now progressively escalating into an internal conflict that would lead to a civil war between Lucius Verus and Commodus. On the one hand, there was Lucius Verus, who claimed to remain the legitimate emperor representing Marcus Aurelius and his will to lead the Romans to greatness and prosperity. Not to mention that hundreds of people and senators witnessed that Marcus Aurelius himself demanded that Lucius Verus should be emperor like him, an indisputable fact for the Senate and the public opinion. And on the other hand, Commodus, who, although far from having exemplary behavior or an irreproachable public image, the world has not yet had the opportunity to know how horrible, cruel, and crazy of an emperor he could be capable of becoming if he ascended to power. And this ignorance sadly could give him a certain advantage and legitimacy, being the legitimate son of Marcus Aurelius, acting hypocritically as someone much more rational and wise than he really was to attract the favors of the Senate and the people, in addition to playing the card of direct legitimacy, because unlike him, who was literally the blood of Marcus Aurelius himself, Lucius Verus was only the adoptive brother of the family, nothing more. For a few years, the situation, although relatively stable, would also be very confusing for all the Romans, with both sides, Lucius and Commodus, staying as far away from each other as possible, Commodus staying in Rome, and Lucius going to live in the eastern part of the empire, implanting his administration in the city of Nicomedia. But eventually, Commodus, playing his cards well to establish himself in power, would try to gain more control and influence over the empire, although more carefully than in reality, having a competent rival such as Lucius Verus. But sooner or later, the madness and psychopathy of that cruel tyrant could not hide much longer, and he, already tired of having the pressure of the memory of his father in the presence of Lucius Verus, would initiate hostilities, and thus a new civil war would begin in the Roman Empire, like the ones we did not see since the death of Emperor Nero, with an aging Lucius Verus having to defend the legacy of Marcus Aurelius and save the Pax Romana at all costs. But unfortunately, it would not be such an easy task, since the crisis that was known as the crisis of the 3rd century in our reality would begin from the end of the 2nd century. Regardless of who would win at the end of that crisis, or how long it would last, it is inevitable that just like in the crisis of our timeline, the price to pay for the survival of the empire would be very high. Too high, even more so now, because obviously most of the conflicts would be unleashed mainly around the Mediterranean, while the Arabian Peninsula would have to sustain itself without the support of the central government of the empire, or even a legitimate emperor. At the same time, they would have to confront the greatest threat that their until now safer lands offered them by the enormous desert by which they were surrounded. The awakening of a new faction of Persians, the Sassanid Persians, who in a few years would completely destroy the Parthian Empire until they completely replaced it. The Sassanid Persians now, seeing that the Roman Empire was in a position of weakness, would do everything possible to attack and destabilize it even further from different angles, attacking and reconquering Armenia, and also attacking and trying to conquer the part of the empire that was less protected and militarized, as it depended too much on its natural barriers, obviously speaking of the Roman provinces of Arabia. Fortunately, after probably several decades of conflict between the multiple factions of the empire claiming to be on the side of Lucius Verus or Commodus, the local elites of Arabia, especially elites of Roman, Greek, or Egyptian origin, who had formed families and dynasties over the last 2 centuries, and with them they would learn to arm and militarize their population by themselves, innovating militarily and technologically to handle large-scale battles in a place as hostile and sparsely inhabited as the Arabian Peninsula, in order to defend themselves from the Sassanids and prevent them from annexing and conquering the Arabo-Romans. It was during that series of wars between the Sasanian Persians and the Arabo-Romans, who were totally isolated from the crisis that was occurring in the 7th century Central Empire, that the concept of the Emperor of the Arabo-Romans would begin to take form among the local elites. And the idea that those Arabian provinces, after all, were able to survive the collapse or the conquest of the Persians without the help of the rest of the empire for years, and therefore eventually it is likely that a sufficiently powerful, charismatic, and competent leader would declare himself emperor, but not of all the Romans, but only of the Romans of the Arabian provinces, declaring the total secession from the rest of the empire, and thus being able to manage much better his power and centralize everything in his capital of the area, to mobilize and train new legions and standardize the military culture in a previously purely commercial and exploratory region of the empire, in order to ensure and implement his legitimacy over his enemies and totally stop the Persians from one day conquering their now imperial lands. And with that, after more than 2 centuries of existence as Roman provinces, and with the Romanization process completely finished, the Arabs would decide to continue with the traditions of the Greco-Roman culture on their own, although it would only be done out of pure necessity to survive and have a more efficient administration in a smaller empire than the original, but they would not wish to have a relationship of enmity or rivalry with the rest of the Roman Empire, still considering themselves as part of that great culture, but simply no longer sharing its same borders and administration. It would also be during this period of separation from the central authority of the empire that the Arabs would likely in this timeline be influenced by the Christians before the rest of the Roman Empire. Because when you think about it, after more than 2 centuries of being a Roman province that was modernized, Romanized, and with a lot of roads built to facilitate mobility in those difficult and hostile terrains, it is not difficult to imagine that in this timeline, Christians would prioritize the spread of their faith first towards the Arabs, given the geographical proximity they shared with them and the ease of access to those lands thanks to Roman architecture. Therefore, I believe it is quite probable that in this timeline the first place where Christianity would have spread massively would be in the Arabo-Roman provinces now turned into an independent empire. And no long after whatever type of crisis the Romans would have experienced during this alternate 3rd century, influenced by their Arabic counterparts, I think the Eastern Greek Romans would also have become Christians, creating even more distance and differentiation with the western heart of the empire, which at that point would have built a lot of resentment towards the Eastern Greeks and Arabs due to their better geographical position and superior wealth. Already in our timeline, the Eastern Roman Empire possessed the majority of the wealth of the entire empire, but here, with centuries of commercial enrichment due to the massive exchange between India and Asia with the eastern parts of the empire, the difference in wealth, resources, and goods would be even greater than in our timeline, with the Eastern Roman Empire and the Arabo-Roman Empire possessing more than 80% of all the wealth of the total empire. That, coupled with religious conflicts over the rise of Christianity, would lead the Eastern Roman Empire to similarly separate itself from the West in a much more aggressive style and approach than in our timeline. While in our timeline, the separation between the West and the East was mostly a mutual and voluntary agreement due to the difficulties of managing such a large empire, but here it would be more about separating themselves from the central Roman authority and being able to manage their interests and wealth by themselves, with the radicalization of Christianity playing a huge role in that event. And with all of that, I think that by the year 300 CE, the 3 most differentiable parts of the Roman Empire would have completely separated themselves from the original birthplace of that same empire. After that, the now Western Roman Empire would feel quite bitter towards its old provinces, but after the huge crisis that they had during the 3rd century, with all the people's deaths and cities destroyed, there was not much they could do against all of that. And of course, all of this resentment and bitterness would likely make them less receptive to Christianity, staying pagans for now. Although it didn't look that way at the time, all of this would be very positive for what remained of the Western Empire. The Romans would have a territory greatly reduced in size, something that would make it much easier for them to administer the remaining provinces. And although the tensions caused by the resentment they felt towards the Easterners could bring problems in the future, the isolationist mentality would force the Romans to refocus on themselves as a culture without the influence of Greek culture, returning to their Roman traditions of the times before the Empire and the Republic, rediscovering their culture and military mentality that would revive the Roman warrior spirit. This would restore the martial vigor of the native Romans of the Italian peninsula, who for many centuries had been greatly softened by depending on soldiers and recruits from other provinces, returning to embracing military duty as a sacred privilege and honor for their culture and empire, along with a very present pagan propaganda. And this resurgence of traditional Roman martial vigor would come in handy during the following decades with the progressive Germanic invasions, while the Hellenistic Romans and the Arabo-Romans, although at odds with the Western Romans, would have been too busy confronting and defending themselves against the Sassanid Persians to directly confront the Latins for the time being. With a now reduced territory to defend, the Western Romans might have ironically a greater opportunity to defend themselves and repel the Germans from their borders, thus restoring a certain welcome prosperity and stability to the now Western Roman Empire. Thanks to that, and no longer depending on recruits from other provinces but mainly on the Italians, the army would be much more organized and loyal to the empire, being perfect for the arrival of the Huns, being able to defend themselves and repel those invaders coming from Central Asia without having to depend on a dubious and unstable alliance with Germanic tribes and Germans supposedly allies of the Roman army, while those same Germans would suffer from the invasions of the Huns and their massacres, greatly facilitating the defense of the Western Roman borders. But eventually, the Huns would disband and disappear completely, just like in our timeline, allowing the Germans to slowly recover from the massacres they suffered at the hands of the Huns, and once again trying to settle themselves into the Western Roman territories. Western Rome would not fall. However, the following centuries would be centuries of constant instability and non-stop battles trying to stop the repeated invasions of the Germans, who were beginning to turn into a more organized and federated culture among themselves, with little by little small kingdoms that would gain more and more power, which would put Western Rome in serious troubles. And with all that, I think that eventually in the long run, Western Rome would no longer be able to hold its northernmost territories, and the Rhine River would not be able to be indefinitely the answer to protect the Romans from the Germans, with them eventually, gradually being able to conquer most of Gaul. But, after all of this, although Western Rome would end up greatly diminished in territory, it would be strengthened in its culture, ideals, and organization, progressively creating over the centuries a new balance of power between the two Western empires that would create a certain stability for those two distinct peoples and cultures. Meanwhile, in the East, the Hellenistic and Arabo-Romans would have been unable to take advantage of the Latins' difficulties, being preoccupied with their own internal problems and affairs, especially with the constant threat of the Sassanid Persians, with whom, as in our timeline with the Byzantines, multiple large-scale conflicts and wars would occur at the time. The difference here is that the Arabo-Romans would also be involved in those conflicts and wars, with whom the Byzantines would have developed a relationship of alliance and mutual closeness, given the cultural and religious similarity created through several centuries of exchanges between the two empires that arose from the original Roman Empire. And with so many fronts to defend at the same time, I think that in the long run it would be impossible for the Sassanid Persians to survive the might of two great powers like the Byzantines and the Arabo-Romans, with both eventually being able to destroy the Persians and conquer their territories, with the Arabs clearly retaining the biggest piece of the pie due to their greater geographical proximity to Persian territory. Furthermore, the Byzantines already had a lot of territories to control compared to our timeline. And who knows, perhaps due to their cultural and religious closeness in this timeline, resulting from centuries of Roman domination, the two empires would eventually unify into one over the centuries, becoming a gigantic power and empire that should not be underestimated. And once that new empire had secured its total and absolute domination on the East, perhaps that would finally give them the opportunity to refocus on the problems of the West, turning their eyes once again on the Western Roman Empire, and more specifically on the city of Rome, the place where it all began so many centuries ago. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and comment on what did you think of it. And without anything else to say, see you next time.